So, hello everyone, welcome to our polity answer discussion. So, today we are going to do the second answer. The question goes like this: even though DPSP or Directive Principles of State Policy are non-justiciable in nature, they are inevitable to the governance of the country. Discuss. So the question is a pretty straightforward, simple question. There is not much complication at all. So it says that on one hand, DPSP is non-justiciable, but it doesn't mean that it is important for governance. Or in other words, you can say that the non-justiciability of DPSP in no way diminish the importance or significance of DPSP for the governance of the country. So you have to prove that point. That is the whole demand of the question. So now let us jump into the structure, how we can structure this particular question. Okay, so introduction can be about making a brief about DPSP, right? Brief about DPSP. So you could say, what is it, how fundamental it is for the governance, what the constitution makers have said about it, how important it is to achieve social and economic democracy, and things like that. Any of those things could be said. And the second statement, yeah, here I missed out something. See, if you look at the statement of the question, it has what do you call? It has some amount of negative tone, right? It's not in the critical sense of the term. So it's saying that even though DPSP are justiciable in nature, it is still important for governance of the country. So it is somewhere the question reflects the fact that the DPSP is not that important for governance, right? Or nobody is giving that importance to DPSP. So when somebody says that, okay, I don't think DPSP is important to this country. So this would be the reply to that. So, okay, I agree that it's not justiciable, but it doesn't make it less important. It is still inevitable. So we are asserting the inevitability of DPSP in the question, which means that it has to hint at overall, what do you call, the lesser important way in which DPSP is managed in public discourse. So that is just my thought. Maybe you can take it like that, or you can just end on your introduction on this brief on DPSP. So if you are convinced with that second point, you could say that, so you could say that what, so even though included in part of the constitution, it hasn't received that public support or government support or things like that. You could just make a mention of it, or the lack of justiciability has prevented DPSP from merging into a effective doctrine. You could say that also in the introduction. Okay, so then you move to the body part of the question, where you have to say you could say the non-justiciability doesn't imply unimportance or diminished importance. Okay, this is something you have to prove. You have to say that the lack of justiciability of DPSP was due to totally some other reason, and it in no way should be affecting the importance of DPSP. So because that is how that tone of the question says, that due to lack of justiciability it is not that important. So you are proving it, you have to prove it the other way. You have to say that it is even the founding fathers, even after independence, the states, both the central and state governments has tried to give significance to DPSP even when it was non-justiciable. That is something you can mention. Then you have to mention the significance of DPSP for governance. Okay, see here the question says only governance. Maybe you can connect it to the significance of DPSP for good governance also. So it doesn't matter much if you yourself do that change. That is all fine, because good governance is always better than governance, right? So you could say how significant DPSP is to achieve good governance. If that is what you have as proper principles, if that is what is available to you, then you could say that so going by these two arguments, we know that, okay, it's lack of justiciability or the predominance of fundamental rights has reduced the importance of DPSP. So, but we still find that DPSP is very important for good governance. Now we have to make a brief mention on the need to mainstream DPSP. Why it is important to mainstream DPSP, you could make a brief mention of it. Then or you could say need to mainstream DPSP and how we can do it. How we can mainstream DPSP. And you could also, see these are all 1-2 point kind of a thing, right? This is, you're not going to write so much on it. How mainstreaming DPSP would improve the situation of citizens in this country. So that could be the conclusion. So how we can mainstream DPSP would be the solution to the diminished importance of DPSP. And finally, as a conclusion, you could say, since there is no space here, I'm putting conclusion here, how that mainstreaming will improve the welfare of the citizens or something of that sort. You could say that in the conclusion. So that is the overall structure. So it's a actually the reason why I have put such a structure is that, see, all these components or all these dimensions can be taken. If you look at the question or if you deconstruct the question thoroughly, you can extract all these dimensions. So obviously we imagine our examiner also to be as sharp or even more sharp than us. So it is always good that you reveal all these dimensions. You make a mention on all these dimensions in the question, in your answer. Okay. So that would make the structure of the answer. Now we will see the actual content of it. Now let us jump into the main answer. So like we said, the introduction could be on DPSP. So you could say that DPSP, or the directive principles of state policy, are a set of principles that are fundamental in the words of founding fathers, are a set of principles that are fundamental in the governance of this country. And the state is supposed to apply these principles in making laws and policies. They are essential to achieve the economic, social, and political program of a modern democratic state. But the lack of justiciability has reduced its significance in the public discourse. Okay, so that is the thing that I said. If you want to add that last part, you are also free to add it, or even otherwise it's fine. See, this is not a question which requires so much of like deft handling of the positive or the middle path. You don't need any middle path here. This is just a plain question. So it's up to you. If you feel like adding that, you can do it. Okay, I'll just say it once more. So it's a set of, in the words of founding fathers, DPSP are a set of principles that are fundamental to the governance of the country, and the state should apply these principles while making laws and policies. And they are very essential to achieve the economic, social, and political program of a modern democratic state. And but a lack of justiciability has reduced its significance in public discourse, or some opine that the lack of justiciability has reduced its significance in public discourse. So that would be your introduction. Then we move to the body part, where you would say that but the lack of justiciability of directive principles never meant that it was less important, at least to our founding fathers. Or our founding fathers never deemed DPSP less important due to lack of justiciability. According to them, mere political democracy without social and economic democracy, which the DPSP is supposed to bring, was meaningless. Okay, so political democracy without social and economic democracy was meaningless to them. So it amply proves the importance they gave to DPSP. Okay, so political democracy without social and economic democracy was meaningless. So, mm, for example, Ambedkar says that the right to vote for a hungry and illiterate man without clothing and shelter meant very little. Okay, so that is Ambedkar's statement. So you could mention that in your answer. So right to vote for a hungry and illiterate man without food and shelter means nothing. So political democracy, which we try to bring through the fundamental rights, through the justiciable fundamental rights, would mean nothing without social and economic democracy, which the DPSP aims to achieve. So that clearly shows the importance of DPSP. Now you could say that, and the lack of justiciability of DPSP was due to a different set of factors, such as lack of justiciability was due to the lack of resources of a newly independent country. So I think you just need to mention that. That is all easily understood for everyone. The huge diversity of the nation. And we didn't want to put so much pressure on that newly fledgling state by imposing justiciability on DPSP also, just like the newly state. We didn't want to crush down the new state under the burden of making DPSP justiciable. So that is the reason why it wasn't made justiciable. It in no way meant it was seemed less important. Okay. So now we move to the crux of the question, which is the significance of DPSP or the inevitability of DPSP for governance. So here maybe you could even define governance when you're writing that. So significance of DPSP to achieve governance, wherein governance means the act of collectively solving societal problems. So you could write that definition also there. So significance of DPSP to achieve governance. So now let us see some of it. Okay, so the DPSP are a set of objectives or ends, 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 objectives or ends or priorities in the minimal sense for a modern democratic state should have, or that the priorities that a modern democratic state should focus on, such as health, education, environment, employment of its citizens, support of the vulnerable sections in the society. So that these are all major priorities which a modern democratic state should be focusing in. So that is one significance of DPSP for governance. So DPSP shows that goals or objectives of governance, or the goals where governance should be focused in. And they are a guiding light to achieve welfare state. So it overall gives the means and ends for governance. Another thing which, if I write it there, you won't be able to see, and they help establish a responsible state. So DPSP helped to establish a responsible state. That is something you have to maybe explain. So without the principles of a DPSP in the constitution, and without it actively pushing the government, the judiciary or the larger civil society won't be able to put enough pressure on the government to go in particular directions, right? So DPSP is that set of principles which can be used by judiciary and as well as the civil society to push the government, to put pressure on the government to act as per the needs of the citizens, right? Or as per the ideal of a modern democratic state. So in that sense, DPSP makes it possible to achieve a responsible state. So being a responsible state is very important to the principle of good governance. Okay, so that is the idea of a responsible state. Then it is very essential to establish an accountable state also, right? So how does DPSP help to establish an accountable state? So, by providing this set of principles with which the public or any organ of the state or any stakeholder in a society, they can judge the performance of the state, right? They can evaluate evaluate the executive in action. So they can identify the shortcomings and they can even penalize the state for its shortcomings. So in that sense, DPSP helps to have an accountable state in the country. So both this sense of responsibility, accountability, or the sense of responsiveness are very essential characters, or they are the central tenets of good governance. Okay, so we saw how DPSP helped to create an accountable state, helped to achieve a responsible state, which are very fundamental to good governance. And it also helped to establish a state of wider social security, right? It helped to achieve, establish state of social security in wider sense, such as providing for securing the right to work, right to education, right to public assistance in case of unemployment, old age, sickness. You can bring in all those examples here, right, when you're writing the answer. And you can basically alleviate the existence of deprivation and lack of all these facilities in the society. So, which again is very fundamental to governance of the country. So that is overall the significance of DPSP in governance. So these are some of the points you can use. But once you said that, you should say, but however, DPSP has been neglected. Has been neglected a lot, largely owing to its lack of justiciability and partly because the rights discourse under fundamental rights has taken so much of predominance in the country, because the civil society, the independent citizens, the judiciary, all of them have been focusing so much on the fundamental rights to guarantee fundamental rights to citizens. The DPSP has been neglected a lot, and our belief was that this public opinion that would be generated by the public as well as other stakeholders would put enough pressure on the state to implement DPSP, but that hopes has been belied. So now it is important to mainstream DPSP. Okay, so it is only when we mainstream DPSP that these principles that are part of DPSP would actually become part of the governance, right? Otherwise, it would still remain in the constitutional book. So, maybe you could give some solutions as to how to mainstream DPSP. I think that could be your final lines. So the National Commission to Review the Working of Constitution, it's also known as M.N. Venkatachalaya Committee report, they have given some concrete suggestions to mainstream DPSP. So they have asked to create a higher body, they are not saying constitutional body or anything, but you could write even that also, a higher body that would examine the implementation of DPSP so far. The implementation of DPSP so far. They would also seek reports from governments. As to how different policies, public policies governments make, right? So governments come up with various government schemes, how different public policies and schemes help to actualize DPSP. So I find this a very practical suggestion and a very sensible one also. So this is something you can solidly write. So in order to mainstream DPSP in this country, we can, as NCRWC suggests, we can put pressure to establish a higher body which would examine the implementation of DPSP in different state and union governments. They would be taking reports from governments as to how the different schemes, policies or acts which the governments come up with are in some way helping to actualize the various DPSP that are yet remaining to be implemented. And they could also identify the extent of resources that are required at different levels of government to implement different DPSP principles. So that is also a meticulous way to make sure that the DPSP gets implemented, right? So having resources, having a budgetary allocation for implementing a DPSP would go a long way to help DPSP exist in practice much more better. So I think this is more or less a good conclusion for you to make. So maybe even in conclusion, you could say that, so it is only when DPSP is realized in the true spirit of the constitution makers that we can finally help achieve social and economic democracy in this country. So that is only the point when we can say that we have established a welfare state. So that could be the last line of your answer, but the conclusion could include this solution also. So I think that is it for this question. So the question is relatively simple, but make sure that you have so many layers to this answer and you bring in so much keywords, NCRWC and different examples and things like that. So that should be good enough to fetch you good marks. Okay, thank you.